Hi, everyone. I'm Richard Greene, and I'm Senior Advisor to Route 50. I hope you enjoyed the last interview between Durango's Jose Madrigal and my close colleague, Catherine Barrett. You may recognize the background. We're husband and wife, and she was sitting here moments ago. We moved very quickly. Um, in this installment of Follow the Money, we're going to continue to follow along the paths of where Catherine and Jose went and explore fraud, waste, and abuse, and particularly in this instance, how to avoid it. I'm really delighted to be here today for the second interview of the day with John Garagosian. He's the state auditor of Connecticut. Um, John also serves as the president of the National State Auditors Association. And I can tell you I've known him for at least 11 years, because I think that's about how long he's been auditor of Connecticut. He is in ranks of men and women who do these very difficult jobs very well. He's one of the best, and I can kind of vouch for that. John, thanks for being here today, and if you're ready, we'll get rolling, because I've got a question to just sort of kick things off with, because I think it'll be useful for our audience a little bit. I know Connecticut's auditor's office has a slightly different arrangement than most of the others do, or maybe all the others do. Can you just talk a little bit about how your auditor's office functions?
I will, and thanks for having me. Nice to see you in person. I know we've talked throughout the years, and it's finally nice to put a face with a name, and appreciate the work you and Catherine do. Well, every state audit agency does something a little bit different. Like, for instance, in Connecticut, we only audit state agencies and quasi-public agencies. But the most unusual thing about our office is it's a bipartisan office run with two auditors running the same office, a Republican and a Democrat. And my colleagues around the country, often ask how that works. And the only reason it works is because we're able to work together, and we literally have to sign on off on everything that leaves our office, be it a letter, an audit report, and everything else. And I've had the pleasure of working with 3 different colleagues over the years, and we've always been able to reach consensus.
Which is a very impressive thing. I've always thought that was really cool, and it shows in the quality of your work. So now let's get to kind of the topic of the day, and tell me a little bit. There's a great deal of money coming in from the federal government now, more than perhaps at any time, certainly at any time in my career, and in waves from the Rescue Plan money, the CARES Act money. What's the auditor's role specifically, if you can, in monitoring the infrastructure projects that are being so heavily funded now, in an effort to, and again, the topic is fraud, waste, and abuse. What do you guys do to help avoid fraud in these infrastructure projects where suddenly there's tons of money flowing out to people who haven't necessarily spent it before? What's your role? How do you do this?
Well, I mean, auditors are historians. We look at things after the fact. So what we do when we're doing our audit work is we try to ensure that agencies have policies, process, and controls in place to root out waste, fraud, and abuse. One of them was just mentioned in last session, having separation of duties. So you can't have the same person that sets up an employee be the same person that authorizes payment for that employee. That happens in procurement also. So we go in and look and to see that agencies are following those policies and procedures. We even make sure we walk through with a frontline employee to make sure that that's actually what is done, and we document any differences in that process. So the most important thing is to make sure that you have controls in place. Now, we haven't had the opportunity to look at any of the federal infrastructure money yet. It really hasn't started being spent. We just released our federal audit on September 20th and found several issues related to COVID and other types of the new funding. But we're in the process of planning for the new federal programs, understanding what the federal requirements are on us as auditors, and creating audit plans to make sure that we address those.
When you talk about walking through with a frontline employee, how does that work?
Well, depending on the agency, say it's a social service agency, we'll actually shadow an employee that's maybe conducting eligibility interviews or, other types of interaction to make sure, well, that they're following the policy, or if, is there a policy in place, but is everybody just disregarding it? Because that's the first kind of, if you have a weakness in your controls, that makes you more susceptible to waste, fraud, and abuse. So we look at those issues. That's one example.
So I guess there's a distinction, isn't there? I think a lot of states, a lot of cities, certainly, if you ask them, how are you avoiding waste, fraud, and abuse, they'll tell you we've got policies in place. But the policies themselves are only halfway there, right? Isn't that kind of the point you were just making? Can you expand on that a little bit?
I mean, exactly. You have to have policies in place, and you have to utilize those policies. And when you get in trouble is when there's exceptions. It's analogous to leaving the safe. You have to have a safe, but if you leave the safe unlocked, people can steal things and things can go awry.
And in terms of infrastructure, where do you think are the potential gaps in the work that's being done? Where do you see hazard signs all over the roads and the bridges that are being built?
Well, I think the first thing is, what should happen is the question we should answer. So first of all, there should be multiple bids, on all construction projects. And, the bid specification should be thorough and complete. Whoever's purchasing the project should have clear expectation of what's being built. And the bids, once they come in, should be analyzed for reasonableness, costs, and quality. And then you should also identify any issues early on in a project and what could be extra that would impact the cost of the project. And those might include topography, structural issues, and environmental remediation. You also should have thorough contracts. The contract should clearly delineate the scope of work and project costs. Lack of clarity in contract often leads to disputes, legal and others, and questions about construction quality and additional costs. You have to monitor the project while it's during the construction, planning, and all those other aspects of the project. And you should require contractors to provide regular cost reports and analyses, as well as, construction progress reports. It's always best to catch things early. And lastly, you have to do thorough and ongoing inspections of the project in real time. Again, you want to catch errors or other omissions early because they lead to additional costs down the line.
That's a great list. I love that. So help me to understand and help the audience to understand how many of those roles are filled by your office and how many of those roles must by necessity be done by the agencies themselves.
Well, auditors can never play a management role. So all those roles are played either by state agencies in our case, or oftentimes they engage private entities to conduct those roles. We go back after the fact and see how they did, and we make recommendations for improvements.
So in terms of monitoring, does your office do any of the monitoring, or is the monitoring all done internally and then you go back and make sure it was done adequately?
Well, specifically when I was talking, monitoring construction projects, happens by the state agencies. And, I think it's a little different related to what we just went through with the COVID fund, issues, in that states have experience building construction projects. The Department of Transportation is involved in major road and bridge projects. We build schools, and state agencies build buildings for themselves. So, it's something we're more used to doing. On the federal side, the programs that had the biggest amount of fraud, and the estimate as of a federal report about a week ago was $46 billion in fraud in unemployment insurance alone. So that is the difference. There's more of an infrastructure in state government to oversee these projects.
So how does the oversight of infrastructure projects differ from the recent experiences with the COVID funds, the funds that you've really been digging deeply into now?
Well, I think, one of the main one of the main issues is the experience of overseeing the funds. One of the things we found with COVID is, and what I know private accounting firms are finding out in the world, is you've had entities get large federal influx of funds that have never had that, never used those types of funds, but also are not familiar with the audit process, the monitoring process, the oversight process. So it's that disconnect. And that was also true of Connecticut. We had agencies that are handling, the Department of Social Services, which does Medicaid, which is about a third of the state's budget. They're used to implementing federal programs. They're used to the reporting aspects. They're used to the compliance aspects. But we had agencies that never played in this space. And that was the biggest challenge. So they didn't necessarily monitor the entities that they gave money to. They didn't necessarily let them know that they were subject to audit. They didn't necessarily, conduct the oversight that was expected of them by a federal government. And that leads to exceptions in our audit report.
So help me understand this. What's to be done if you've got an agency that hasn't done this kind of work before because they've never had this kind of money for these kind of infrastructure projects before, or any of the projects being supported by federal funds? Does your office help train them to adequately come up to snuff? That the Medicaid agency may be huge, may have all this capacity. Smaller agencies that don't have the capacity, how do they grow it?
Well, that's a challenge for all of us. Because on top of having all this extra work, Connecticut, for instance, lost about 10% of its workforce by July 1st of last year. So everybody's scrambling, including our offices, with recruiting and retaining employees. We are talking about that this morning because the last 2 years, the government gave a 6-month extension on the federal audit, and they're not doing that this year. So that has to be into the federal government by end of March of 2023 for fiscal year 22. That's going to put a lot of strain on all of us because, I guess it's the answer to your question is through communication and information. However, we can never play that management role, and that's the struggle we have. We can't tell them exactly how to report it. We can tell them they have to report it and what the requirements are.
So is it an accurate thing to think that it's an unfortunate conflux of two events? One is all this additional money is coming in that needs to be monitored, needs to be audited, needs to be overseen properly. At the same time as there's such a shortage of staff in so many of the agencies because the states just can't hire enough people. Is this a problem that just when the job is bigger, you've got fewer people to deal with it?
It is very much that, and that's why one of the only positive things to come out of the COVID pandemic is that we've greatly improved our communication with our federal and local partners. So since I think the summer of 2020, we've had monthly and now bi-monthly calls talking about all those issues, and the federal government is finally, we're appealing to them to kind of streamline the federal audits to what's most important to them. Connecticut, we have 100 auditors or so. We have the wherewithal to move people around. Other states are struggling tremendously with that, as is the public accounting firms, because they have all this extra work and they don't have the resources to complete it. It's not an issue in Connecticut, but certainly an issue around the country.
So I'm going to broaden things out a little bit. What from your perspective is new in the effort to fight waste, fraud, and abuse? What are the things that you're most excited about seeing as the evolution of this effort?
Well, certainly technology is playing more a role in our world like it is for everybody else. There's several accounting and project management tools to identify issues and anomalies in real time. And the auditing community is really moving to data analytics. Now, when we go in to do an audit now, for the most part, we might look at procurement and we'll look at 100 transactions against the sample, maybe thousands of transactions. Right now, we can look at every single transaction and look at an entire universe to identify issues and anomalies. So we might be looking for, say, in order to, you don't have to bid on things that are under $10,000, for instance. coincidentally, there might be a lot of $9,999 items purchased by agencies. That's a red flag. And that's the kind of thing we would look at. We have that happen with agencies often. They split up an order to kind of avoid that bidding requirement. As an example, when we go into audit a state agency, we look at every former employee to see if they have computer and badge access, as an example. So that's changing the world of auditing. Also the federal government has what's called the Do Not Pay program. It's the U.S. Treasury's program. And they have the ability for state agencies on the management side to vet payments in real time before they go out the door. So they don't allow you to pay an agency that's been debarred or somebody that they know is not qualified for a program. Obviously, that's not on our end. The other thing that they offer is free data analytics to state auditors and state agencies. So we're doing our first project with them related to SNAP.
Mm-hmm. So when I knew I was going to be talking to you today, there was one question I really wanted to get in because it has to do, at least in its origins, with my hometown, which is West Haven, Connecticut, just west of New Haven, Connecticut. And it's been very much in the press lately, and I've been kind of following it. Catherine and I follow everything that's happening in all the states and all the big cities, but I follow West Haven because I've got a lot of friends there, and still my aunt lives next door to where I grew up. And there's been a lot in the press about alleged fraud involving, I guess it was $600,000 in misspent and fraudulently spent rescue plan dollars. And I've heard that your office, because I wanted to check into what you guys were doing about this, wants the legislature to consider requiring local government bodies to hold public meetings when financial difficulties are discovered. Taking off from West Haven, could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, the issue specifically in West Haven, obviously money was stolen by a city employee and others who was a former state representative, and the case is pending. But an audit conducted on behalf of the city of West Haven found approximately $900,000 out of $1.1 million in coronavirus funds was spent on things that were not allowed under the program. The red flag in this case, and what is dumbfounded us, is that in 2020, the city of West Haven had an audit, its regular audit, that said that they were susceptible to somebody creating a false entity and paying it. And that begs the question, why didn't anybody do anything about it at that time? And, we release an annual report every year. We have recommendations. And one recommendation we came up with on this is at least that the local government body would have a required public hearing to talk about the nature of the deficiency in the audit and potential solutions, that at least it wouldn't be, a surprise down the line.
And what's happening? Do you know offhand what's happening in West Haven now?
I don't. Everything's been relatively quiet. West Haven is one of the, I think, 3 towns under the, there's a municipal review board for distressed cities, both financially and others. So they're under the thumb of that board. But certainly, I would say they're an anomaly. I don't think that this type of fraud is what has been prevalent. I've been in government for over 30 years, and I've never seen anything to the magnitude of this, where it was an actually misspending of local funds. So it's but we go back to the original conversation that if, in this specific case, if the department had to sign off on the largest contracts and say, yeah, we didn't, those were real contracts and you should pay them, it's simple, an email would have prevented some of this fraud. And that didn't happen. You have to have those controls that we talked about earlier. You can't have the same person create an invoice and pay it. You can't have the same person create an employee and pay them. So that's part of what went wrong here.
That's interesting. Well, good luck to my friends back home. In the meantime, we've got about a minute or so left, and I want to ask you one quick question. And that is, we've been talking about fraud, waste, and abuse as though they're just this mish of 3 things. Can you just quickly help the audience to understand what's the difference between the 3? Because fraud is not the same as waste, it's not the same as abuse.
Right, and fraud is probably the most rare of the three related to, state and local government. Other than the biggest issue with fraud right now is external actors, be they national or international, mostly. And, IT kind of related identity fraud, ransom, those types of attack. But fraud is wrongful or criminal deception intended to result in a financial or personal gain. So the intent is there. I'm trying to steal. I'm doing something deliberately. Waste is thoughtless or careless expenditure, mismanagement, or abuse of resources. So, it's a little, obviously not keeping an eye on expenditures, spending on things you don't really need. We had that happen at the University of Connecticut a few years ago, where they spent millions of dollars on a computer program that they didn't use for a year. And lastly, abuse is excessive or improper use of a thing or to use something in a manner contrary to natural or legal rules for its use. So abuse could be financial or non-financial. So somebody taking a piece of equipment home to mow you're taking a lawnmower to mow their lawn or something. But also, again, not spending things properly.
Terrific. I think that's a great clarification. I appreciate it. And I think we've run out of time, which is unfortunate because I'd love to be able to chat about a lot more things. I want to thank you again, John, for joining us today and sharing your experience with our audience.